Sir Francis Drake, swashbuckling scourge of the Spanish Main, one of the first humans to circumnavigate the globe, Mayor of Plymouth, and the man who nonchalantly saved Britain from an invasion. All despite being called Francis. Last year there was a bit of a stir when a London primary school decided to change its name from Sir Francis Drake Primary School to Twin Oaks Primary School, ostensibly because Drake had been involved in the slave trade. Actually though, there was no stir at all. Almost all of the teachers, parents and pupils of the school had voted to change the name. No fuss. But, of course, living as we do in the age of the culture war, certain media outlets decided to stoke up the fires of indignation. History was being rewritten, heroes were being cancelled, the children were being brainwashed. Well, as Drake had some strong connections with Dartmoor, he falls under my jurisdiction, so time for me to dip my oar in. Was he a hero, or was he a bastard? Should we judge historic figures by the moral standards of today? And how do we teach future generations about divisive figures without eroding our heritage? Just some of the questions I'll be posing today, then running away from to let you argue it out in the comments. Welcome back to the Dartmoor podcast. To the people of Plymouth, it would appear, Drake was a hero. He started many of his famous voyages from there and was elected as Janatown's MP twice. Just a brief walk around the place revealed a guest house, a shopping centre, a road, a jeweller's, an island, and a scaffolding company named in his honour. But to the people of the moor, he appears to be a strange occult figure connected with evil. In Dartmoor folklore, for example, he is one of the characters who joins the devil at the head of the wild hunts through the spooky boulders of Wistman's Wood. How did he end up with such polarised legacies? I have a theory about this, but before we get there, we need a brief biography to understand the man better. Francis Drake was born in Tavistock almost 500 years ago, somewhere around 1540. We don't know his exact age because he wasn't, as you might expect, from some rich and noble family, instead being the son of a farmer. So, from now on, you can imagine him talking with a proper Westcountry accent. "All right, me lover." Yet, from these humble beginnings, he ended up incredibly famous and absurdly wealthy, owning, among many other properties, the impressive Buckland Abbey out on the western edge of the moor, which I'll be using as background scenery to my wafflings today. At a young age, Drake was put in the care of the relative, a Plymouth sailor called William Hawkins, to be apprenticed into the life of a sea dog. In this, he was a prodigy. Drake took to the water like a duck to water, and by the age of 18, he was already commanding his own trading vessel in the Channel. And things soon got morally murky. His second cousin, John Hawkins, saw the Spanish and Portuguese making a fortune out of trading African slaves and wanted in on the profits. As a young man, Drake joined these expeditions, which involved either pirating slaves off the Portuguese or raiding native villages and capturing them, before selling them on to the Spanish in the Caribbean. I think it's important here to note that he wasn't some slave trading mastermind, rather he was just another young seaman trying to get rich in a very lucrative venture. Not that I'm excusing him either. Murdering and capturing his fellow men and selling them into lives of slavery where they would be treated as objects is, obviously, morally reprehensible. The sheer weight of human misery is almost impossible to fathom. To me, it's hard to believe that the people doing this couldn't see that they were doing something wrong, that their consciences, even 500 years ago, didn't tell them to find another way to make a living. But then they had the blessing of both the Queen and the Pope. The slave trade, at this early stage, it would seem, had less to do with white supremacy than it did with religious discrimination. The Africans were heathens and deserved whatever they got. All in all, Drake was part of several voyages between 1562 and 1569 that resulted in over 1,000 people being enslaved and perhaps 3 times that many being slaughtered. But on his final slaving mission, Drake was on the end of something rather dramatic. He and his cousin's fleet were attacked by the Spanish. Totally outnumbered, our brave Drake, it would appear, did a runner, leaving his relative to die and sailing back to England with all the treasure. He had some tough questions to answer, though, when Hawkins somehow managed to escape and also made it back to England. This event, it would seem, stoked in Drake a hatred of the Spanish that would guide his future actions. From then on, he was driven by revenge and spent the rest of his life attacking them at every opportunity, earning him the nickname El Drac, the Dragon. As a privateer, Drake excelled. He'd wait for the Spaniards to plunder the riches of the New World, then nick it all off them as they tried to sail it home. We are talking about literal tons of gold and silver here. He became very rich and rather famous. But not as rich and famous as he was to become. What happened next was an adventure that would be the making of him. In 1577, at the head of a small fleet, aboard his ship the Pelican, later to be renamed the Golden Hind, Drake set off on a voyage to circumnavigate the globe, a foolhardy mission that had only been achieved a handful of times before, never by an Englishman, and not at all in the last 50 years. From Plymouth, he crossed the Atlantic, rounded the dangerous Cape Horn, losing all of his ships except his own. Then, as the first Englishman to reach the Pacific, he sailed up the west coast of South America, surprising the Spanish colonies there, raiding and pillaging as he went, amassing a huge quantity of plunder and rebuilding his fleet with stolen vessels. Drake continued north, exploring the uncharted territories of what is now California and perhaps beyond, before, for good measure, crossing the Pacific, trading some of his booty for spices in the Far East, then toodling round the Cape of Good Hope and returning to England. The whole journey had taken 3 years and cost the lives of 2/3 of his crewmen. Imagine the reaction in England. Drake would in all likelihood have been presumed dead, but instead he arrived in Plymouth with tons upon tons of gold and silver, valuable artefacts, precious jewels, fine silks, exotic spices, and, I'm sure, a few good stories to tell too. The people who had invested in his voyage made more than a 4,000% profit, including Queen Elizabeth I, whose share of the bounty totalled a sum greater than all the taxes and profits made out of England in the entire year. He was promptly knighted, made an MP, and elected Mayor of Plymouth a year later. But not everyone was so pleased with Drake. Buckland Abbey belonged to another legendary seafarer and explorer, Richard Grenville, a biddy bay and contemporary of Drake who had dreamt of being the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. Indeed, in the Abbey's great hall, on the ceiling, there remain 4 rather stereotypical plaster carvings commissioned by Grenville to represent the 4 continents. Europe on one side, America, Asia and Africa on the other. The mission round the world had been his idea, and Drake had stolen it. When Drake decided he wanted to use some of his fortune to buy Buckland Abbey from Grenville, he was point-blank refused. So Drake set up an intermediary to trick him and bought it anyway. Grenville must have been furious. Now, back to Dartmoor. After all the swashbuckling and galleons of gold and craftily acquired mansions, we get a somewhat more provincial story about Drake in his time as Mayor of Plymouth that I think gives us a measure of the man. In the late 16th century, the city was lacking a consistent water supply, so it was decided that a watercourse should be built to tap the River Meavy at what is now the site of Burrator Reservoir. It would provide the citizens of Plymouth with fresh water, allow the irrigation of neighbouring fields, be a useful resource to the industry of the dockyard, and be a great help in firefighting too. A no-brainer. Drake took on the challenge and added an extra clause that would allow the water to be used to power some mills along the route too. Even better. The Leat was built to meander slowly towards the city and still exists today, though it's now dried up. And Drake's Trail, a walking and cycling route, roughly follows its path along the western edge of the moor to the outskirts of Plymouth. In 1591, Drake himself released the water, then, possibly apocryphally, rode a white steed ahead of it as it rushed down to the city. Fancy bugger. But on closer inspection, this Leat wasn't all it seemed. It didn't make it to the dockyards, nor anywhere else it would provide a useful supply of water, and Drake actually made a profit out of its construction, being given £200 in funds to make it, but spending only 60. And remember those mills? Well, they all belonged to Drake. In the late 16th century, he was using tricks right out of the modern populist politician's playbook. Do something that benefits yourself, but dress it up in something flashy with a simple narrative, and suddenly you're a hero and all anyone's talking about. And we see this pattern repeat itself a few times over in Drake's life. For example, Drake's most famous act was, supposedly, to save Britain from a Spanish invasion. He was playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the news of the vast Spanish Armada reached him, and rather than leaping into panicked action, he smoothly finished his game before sashaying down to the docks and winning a heroic victory. But in reality, his part in the defeat of the Spanish Armada was small. He captured one wrecked galleon. Yet because of the legend about him finishing his game of bowls, he's the name we associate with it. Also, on a side note, this story manages to make him look cool despite the fact he was playing bowls. Even in his last acts, as he was dying of dysentery off the coasts of Panama, we have a self-aggrandizing gesture. Drake's drum, an instrument that travelled the world with him, was sent back to Buckland Abbey, and he claimed that if it was struck when England was in danger, he would return from death to protect us. The drum itself is now in a museum in Plymouth, and it is said to have let out a supernatural thump at several times throughout history, including the outbreak of World War I and during the Battle of Britain in World War II. All this pageantry and flair might have impressed the courtiers and members of city society, but I wonder if the simple people of the moors looked through his fancy pants nonsense and saw a self-serving narcissist with a penchant for the dramatic. Or maybe the pious moorland folk took these stories about racing against rivers, spectral drums and returning from the dead as evidence that Drake was dabbling in the occult. It would explain why, despite being a heroic figure everywhere else, in Dartmoor legend he is an evil figure, riding alongside the devil at night to run down the unwary traveller. In summary, Drake is, to say the least, divisive. On the one hand, we have his involvement in the slave trade and the general scheming, murdering and plundering that followed. On the other, we have a navigational and military genius performing great feats of bravery and endurance for his country. My verdict, if I'm forced to give one, Sir Francis Drake was a bastard. But a bastard of such magnitude that it's hard not to sort of admire him in a way. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.